In this paradigm, I want to look at probability fields and the nature of the ego in relationship to probability fields. Here we have an equation, 6 times 3 plus 7 equals. And we generate a probability field. Probability fields are, by their nature, spherical. Within, for example, the choice, this equation might be the choice to go to a family dinner. Within the probability field of the family dinner, there is a certain probability field where if every person engages like this, the experience might be over here. If every person engages like this, the probability might be over here. Within the equation of capitalism, for example, there is a necessity that there is a certain amount of unemployment. There is a necessity that there are some people who will have more money than other people. There is a necessity that for any given free market venture, for example, if 3 bids are gathered, that 1 bid will be chosen for the job. That's the probability field created by capitalism. Now, having participated in the co-creation of a probability field, the human ego then zooms in to occupy a small bit of geographic space within that probability field. I, as an ego, cannot simultaneously be the winning bidder and the losing bidder. Though within that probability field I can take certain actions in order to be either the winner of the bid, if I'm bidding on a project, or the loser on a bid. The actions that I take as a human ego to prepare determine where I'm likely to fall within the probability field created by the paradigm of the event, the event of a bidding experience, the event of a buying experience. And determined by personal values, which may or may not be cultural values, I may ascend higher on those values and find a particular position. And so you might have, like up in the top corner up in here, you might have amongst all of the probabilities, the probability of a satisfied customer, the probability of getting the bid, the probability of making a lot of money on the bid, the probability of enjoying the process, the probability of completing it on time, the probability of exceeding expectations. And so I might prepare in a variety of ways to end up in this location of the probability field. Now, within the probability field of a culture, there is again a similar framework. Some people in our culture are sexually violated. Some people are sexually violating. Some people are depressed. Some people are joyful. And again, the relationship, the navigational equipment within the human ego determines what point on that probability field we find ourselves. And so, in many ways, in a fractal pattern, we see probability field upon probability field upon probability field, where the nature of being physical, for example, as far as we experience it, includes a probability field of pain and pleasure. The nature of being an individual within a particular probability field within a probability field. So you have the probability field of being physical, then you have the probability field of this particular planet, and you have the probability field of this particular time, and the probability field of this particular culture, and the probability field of this particular family, and this particular line of work. And within each of these probability fields, we then have the probability field within our own beliefs, within our own personal paradigms, within our own personal thoughts, within our ability to imagine. For example, if I cannot imagine a win-win collaboration with a competitor, then a win-win collaboration with a competitor may be outside of my probability field. So if I can only imagine a win-lose dynamic, then the question, now that I'm in that probability field, in which there's going to be winners and losers, where will I be in the winning category or the losing category? And so one of the significant thoughts or awarenesses of this nature of positioning, much like, and if we look at probabilities, like longitudes and latitudes on a planet, and we look at probabilities in terms of longitudes and latitudes in time, we can see that this kind of Russian doll dynamic of probability field within probability field within probability field ultimately comes down to us as a human ego. And there is a probability field determined on where we put our consciousness. So is it on the part of our reality that is physical? Because one of the aspects that's most important about this on an individual level is that the fractal and holographic nature of reality is such that within the piece of the individual is contained the pattern of the totality. And so within within the fractal pattern of the human ego is contained the pattern of that which is not the human ego, that which is not physical, that which is not on this planet, that which is not on this time, that which is not currently conscious, that which is conscious being the zoom-in telescopic lens, where a certain part of reality, a certain place in time, a certain place in, in this case, in physicality relative to non-physicality, etc., is in this particular location. We have the fractal awareness of that which is beyond the particular set and set and set and set of probabilities that we find ourselves in. And within that, we can not only navigate within the terrain of what is the set that is around us, but that which is the set in which we are currently occupying ourselves. And within a given probability field, there is the entire range between fixation, identification, and complete domination or control, meaning the sense that we can never change or move any of this, to the point of being outside of the set even. And we can identify with the compassionate loving of that which is fixated. And so you have the range of possibility of where we are located within a given probability field. But we also have the range of probability for how to relate to every other part of the probability in which we are located. And so, for example, if I'm a billionaire, happily winning all the bids in the capitalistic system, we could say that I'm high in the probability field of, quote, success, the high ranking as somewhat self-defined, within a capitalist framework or probability field. But then we have the other part of the probability field, which is, who am I in relationship to someone who, for example, has never won at anything? Do I relate to that with terror and fear? Do I relate to that with generosity? Do I relate to that with teaching? Do I relate to it from a truth that says there is enough for all? Which is to a certain extent to relate outside of the set of capitalism, for example, because within the capitalist framework you have, a winner and a loser. But that's just within that framework. And so there is a physical position occupied, and there's a psychological position that's occupied. And one of the things in the different layerings of self, because you have the ego, which is the zoom-in lens, you have the larger self that is the probability field of which we are a part. Meaning that if we find ourselves in a probability field in which X amount of wars are happening, X amounts of rapes are happening, X amounts of miracles are happening, X amounts of, so we have the whole probability field of a given culture within a set of physical reality. We're within that probability field. And the probability field is revealed through statistical data on the dimensions that are analyzed, of course. So the probability field of molestation, for example, you take 1,000 people and you count how many people within a given period of time are molested. And so you have within a given number of people, a certain number are molested and a certain number are not, and a certain number are afraid of being molested, and a certain number are not, and a certain number are joyfully meditating, and a certain number are not. And so you have within the larger probability field, you have in a given dimension, in this case a dimension of molestation, you have a probability field. And then within that probability field, you have the range of everything that's probable, which is the statistical gathering of that given cube, which is simply a matter of distinctions. You can measure it in inches, you can measure it in miles, you can measure it in minutes, you can measure it in gradations of color. You've got a location. And when you have the statistical data of that particular metric, in this case a metric of molestation, you now have the feedback of what this particular paradigm at this particular junction in the flow, in the evolution of reality, what it generates, the particular level of consciousness, what it generates as a statistical probability field. Now, as we change variables, as we use that feedback to draw attention, to change the set, to change the paradigm of the participants of consciousness within a given location, we can now change location. We can now go to another cube where molestation rates are down 90% with a different set of variables, and we can gain the feedback of that. As we get feedback of what goes up and what goes down, much like sailing a ship around the globe. As we get closer to the equator, we understand that things are getting warmer. We understand that going this way, we get warmer, and then at a certain point we reach maximum temperature, and then if we keep going the other way, it starts getting cooler again as we go from the North Pole to the equator and then to the South Pole. And we understand, as we head this way or this way, as we travel east or west, there's a different weather pattern as a statistic. And so, depending on the desired weather pattern, we can position ourselves on a part of in a part of the weather system that is most conducive to our particular values, while understanding that in the larger set of being part of a planet, that by navigating ourselves, we're not changing the ice at the North and South Pole. We're positioning ourselves in relationship to those things into an optimum temperature range. And as we develop more and more mastery, we might fly to this location at this time of year, and this location at another time of year, and this location at another time of year, understanding that we're not changing the geography of the planet. We are changing our relationship with that geography and the planet. There will still be people who are cold at the North Pole and people who are cold at the South Pole when they're out exposed to the elements. And when we are cold, there will still be people who are warm. And so there is, within a given set, within mathematical set theory, there's a given set of variables, and we find our relationship with those variables. And one of the things that guides every consciousness in a larger sense is the movement towards beauty, the movement towards truth, the movement towards goodness, as conceptualized, as understood, which is often a movement towards grace, and intelligence, the efficiency with which energy is transformed into human well-being. In a state of mastery within any set, we use the skill, the consciousness, and the variables at our disposal, the choices at our disposal, to locate ourselves in a part of the probability field that is easier, that is more graceful. And we also have this sense of challenge, this sense of adventure. And so, for example, if it gets too easy to the point where it becomes almost unconscious. It's just too effortlessly easy to be happy in this idyllic tropical location, etc. And there's not enough challenge to engage us within the larger paradigm of human consciousness, which is conscious through distinction between pain and pleasure, distinction between joy and happiness, between 2 out of 10 pleasure and 10 out of 10 pleasure. We then navigate towards more challenging environments. If I can be happy in the Caribbean with beaches and swimming and nice music, etc., perhaps there's the challenge. Can we create this state in a different environment? Or there's a different thing, like how could I create this kind of peace and awareness living in an igloo in the North Pole? What would that flavor of well-being be? Because of course there is a range of joy and ecstasy and satisfaction and mastery in learning the whole world of that reality, as well as learning the whole world of this reality. How do I create joy and well-being within the given pocket in which I'm located, within this probability? And in doing so, there is a tendency to develop more and more freedom to locate within different probability fields, different sets. For example, if I master the capitalist framework within my location, I may travel to another location in which there's more freedom, more grace in experiencing the types of experiences that I want to experience, in developing new skills. And so while certain things are very natural, it is our nature to be curious, it is our nature to grow, it is our nature to understand the different parts of ourself, and it is our nature as we move into different terrains and environments to want to bring something towards beauty, truth, and goodness as we find ourselves in that terrain. So one of the implications is that by being part of a probability field, by being part of a set, so to speak, that while the human ego blocks out all of the other parts of the probability field and says, I'm me and that's you. One of the things, for example, with human consciousness on the planet is that what we see is human consciousness in human body expressed in the probability field of the planet as we know it today, in the country as we know it today. We have a range of probabilities, and we have a paradigm, a mathematical model through which to relate to reality that is much simpler than the underlying complexity of the actual reality. It's like we don't experience the infinite gradations of the sphere. We maybe break it down into 5 points. And through these 5 points, we move a little bit this way, towards that one, a little bit this way, and we can locate ourselves with a mental map of reality that's much cruder than the actual map of reality, but can help us navigate and trade things off, and make different choices about how we can win or lose within a particular paradigm, within a particular probability field. And yet, the individuals that are to the left and the right of us, the individuals who are living here, are actually an expression of the same human consciousness of which we are a part. Just how do they express themselves within their current level of consciousness in this location? For example, if you live in the Philippines and you've been invaded by multiple countries with a dominance type paradigm, and you have learned culturally that one of the best ways is to adapt to the invader. One might develop a coping strategy with higher levels of dishonesty as a probability field, a coping strategy of acquiescence, of inauthenticity in certain areas in order to avoid the friction with these different, Spanish, United States, Japan, all these different China, all these different forces invading. There's a different probability field within the culture, and so it's the same human consciousness. It's the same human consciousness, just in a different probability field as the human consciousness in another country that, for example, Thailand has not been conquered. And so you have a much deeper sense of authenticity, but you have other things that come with the myopia of not being challenged in one's given paradigm. It's a, in that larger sense, the point of this is to understand that the human consciousness, the essence of human consciousness, is an ecology, is one consciousness expressed in a variety of environments created by the probability field of being at the Earth at these in physical form and these with these observing and measuring devices at this moment in time. And so in that extent, how do we relate to one another? How do we relate to one another in which are different parts of the same probability field? How do we relate to the probability field as individuals is the first part of the metric. Where do we locate ourselves within the system that we find ourselves? How do we transform the system to increase the probability field towards beauty, truth, and goodness, natural instinctive urges, and within that framework, how do we then relate to others who are responding and learning and growing within slightly different to largely different environments? One of the interesting things that I noticed in spending time in tropical warm countries, having grown up in a cold country, is there's much more immediacy, there's much more presence. Because in a tropical warm country, you don't have to prepare for the winter. You don't die if you refuse to dissociate from the moment and cut wood. You don't die. And so there's much more immediacy. So me growing up in that culture would be more immediate than me growing up in a culture where if I don't prepare for the winter, I'm dead or at least miserable. And so we have a different framework of relating to a different environment within a probability field that goes from very cold and seasonal to very temperate and more consistent. And so which parts of me do I want to explore and develop? And so this is one of the navigation paradigms. This is one of the navigation paradigms that I use as I relate to the world. Now there's a couple of implications of this that are interesting. One is the fact that with complexity comes a higher probability field. The other is the awareness of synergy, that when all of the different individuals within a given set, within a given species, the human species at this moment in time, cooperate and collaborate towards individual well-being, take ownership of the entire organism of human consciousness of which we are a part, And when we understand that with the cyclical nature of reincarnation, male, female, different races, etc., that when we sustain big inequities, be it in money, be it in sexuality, be it in power, be it in voice, be it in influence, etc., when we sustain inequities, that as we journey through the entire probability field of the human system, we create more volatility. And that volatility does lead to pain, and pain does lead to consciousness. And consciousness does lead to the remediation of pain, because it leads to a balancing of the system as pain is transferred. Often if one person is in a highly unequal state with another in a dominance type dynamic that sustains the inequality, then as consciousness recycles through, if we can imagine that part of our human journey is to experience the entire probability range of humanity, we also understand that the movement towards ownership and working as a species releases higher synergies, higher complexities, higher possibilities, less volatility in pain. And in some ways, if we think of this as a simulation or as a game, the game can be, for example, within a dualistic system, how do we reach the level of consciousness as a species where we transcend the paradigm and create a new environment together that transcends the probability field of the environment in which we entered. It's like starting as a billion video game players in a game, that there's certain ways that you can collaborate and cooperate to actually move out of the game, to transcend the game and move on to another level with a more interesting game, with a game that's more fun. But that the growing process is first to transcend the human ego, to become a winner within the set of that probability field, and then transcend that to a certain extent and become part of a bigger game, a game of collaborating and partnering rather than dominating and win-lose dynamics, collaborating and partnering. To use the win-lose paradigm, certainly to draw out the best in one another and become better, but to reach a level of consciousness where through win-lose that one can be potent collaborators. So a few closing thoughts.